This is our 5th video in our Romans 13 Understanding Submission to Government series. And here I want to talk about the fact that the authority spheres that God has put in place do actually interact. So he said that there was a very clear distinction between family, church, and the state. And that those are the 3 spheres of authority that we see spoken to in the Bible. But the next thing, so I'm going to show how they are distinct, but I also want to show how they do overlap. They do interact. So the distinction between those spheres is very clear. The family, ruled by the parents, the church, ruled by the elders, the state, ruled by the civil authorities, they are distinct. The church is not allowed to walk into a man's house and tell him what nights they have lasagna on, when they smack or don't smack their kids, what shows they're allowed to watch, what clothes the kids wear, what brand of nappies they're going to buy. That is not the church's authority. If they do that, you're in a cult, or your pastor is largely overstepping his authority. And it goes the other, even between families. Fathers cannot do that to other families. They're simply not the father or heads of those other families. And also, it applies from state to the church. The state is not allowed to walk in on a Sunday and tell me, or tell the pastors of a church, or tell the elder board what songs they're allowed to sing, what doctrines they're allowed to teach on, and things like that. Because there is a distinction or a separation between the church and the state. Now, when we speak of separation of church and state, what we don't mean, and this is what too many people mean, I think, when they say separation of church and state, is they mean a separation between thinking religiously and thinking politically. Now, that's very dangerous, and that's not at all accurate. That's not what it is meant in our law, and it's not what should be meant by people who want to promote it. It does not mean the separation of morality defined by God and the civil authorities. That's not what this is meaning. When we talk about separation of church and state, what we mean is the separation of their authority rulers. That the rulers are different people. The pastor doesn't have the ability to make laws for his congregation in the country. The government does not have the power to make ecclesiastical decisions on who is members, who is under church discipline, and things like that. There is a distinction in the authorities. That does not mean we don't think religiously and theologically about what laws are put in place or about who we vote for, and the like. God's word does not stop applying outside the church. So we need to still think as Christians when we're voting, when we're thinking about the laws, when we're writing petitions, signing petitions. In Australia, what this means, and when it's in our constitution, what it means by the separation of church and state is that the state, the federal or state authorities are not allowed to establish a state church. They're not allowed to say Anglicanism is Australia's religion, or Buddhism is Australia's religion, or Baptists are Australia's church. They're not allowed to do that and enforce it. And they're also not allowed to go the other way and discriminate intentionally or make laws that discriminate against religions. So, and also it has something about there's not allowed to be a religious test when you're running for office in Australia, and that's all. That's all fine. I might be confused on that last one. Anyway, so for the individual, particularly, so for the individual person watching this, trying to learn how do I engage as a Christian who has laws around me that I don't agree with, but I'm trying to obey Romans 13, that's why you've tuned in. For you need to realize that your duty as a Christian and your duty as a civilian in Australia, or whatever country you live in, overlap. They interact. They have a lot to do with each other. In other words, you don't stop being an Australian citizen when because it's a Sunday and you're going to church. It doesn't mean that because it's church you're allowed to go home and smoke whatever you want, import whatever goods you want that are against the border laws, or you're allowed to skim some money off of your rates and utilities that you pay the government because I don't pay pay rates for Sundays because I'm a Christian on those days and my citizenship is in heaven. So I'll only pay, taxes and land taxes on 6 days out of the week. That's not how it works. A Christian is a civilian within a civilization. We have a citizenship elsewhere and we have citizenship here. They're just distinct and they're different. And they go on the other way as well. It doesn't mean that you stop being a Christian on a Monday. Once Sunday clicks off, you don't start being able to watch whatever movie you want, though it's immoral. It doesn't mean you remove God's laws from your life because now I'm under Australia's laws. This is obvious. They interact and you must uphold both at the same time. Christians, your Christian duty and your Australian duty as a civilian, even though one of them has the higher demand on you, which is your Christian obligations. But it does mean that Christians need to know how to be good citizens. Pastors often talk about this in such a way as to say, you need to steward your vote well. God gives you the opportunity in this day and age to have a vote for the federal government, state government, local government. Therefore, steward that well. Use it well to a God-glorifying way. And in the same way, when we stand up for worthwhile causes or whatever we do, we need to use our God-given freedom for good, for God-glorifying, people-loving, gospel-advancing good. That's what we should do. But this also means if we're to be using our freedom for good, then we need to be careful that we don't grant illegitimate power and we don't assent to tyranny. We don't grant illegitimate power to tyrants and we don't assent and accept and nod when tyranny occurs. In fact, that is not just being a bad Christian. That's being a bad citizen. Acts 5:29 shows us this reality. I'll swing there. Shows us that there is at least an interaction between our duty to man and our duty to God. Acts 5:29, of course, is when Peter is talking to the Sanhedrin and he tells them, this is often known, often misunderstood, this verse, on this whole discussion. One little thing that will need to come to the surface. Peter knows that the Sanhedrin, though they have legitimate fear from the people, like people obeyed the Sanhedrin and they did what they were told, but there's no biblical God-given institution for the Sanhedrin. They weren't duly appointed by God. They were not put in place by, the Romans in a legitimate way. They really had no power except to bring religious condemnation to people. And then they still had to go to Pilate if they wanted to kill anybody anyway, like they did with Jesus, which they failed to do with Stephen, which was their problem. But obviously they kept that secret. But Peter, looking at these men, they say, don't keep on preaching, don't preach the name or the resurrection of Jesus. And he says, we must obey God rather than men. So if somebody tries to puff up their chest and tries to put on a hat that God didn't give them to wear, to try and exact authority over you that is not actually God-given authority, you don't nod and smile and say, I accept your authority in these areas and grant them tyrannical power. You don't grant them illegitimate authority. In fact, speaking up and saying, you're being illegal, you don't have this authority, is the act of responsible citizens. So my fear of the backlash of that, if somebody is utilizing power they've not been given by God, if they're breaking the Constitution, if that's a defined authority, if they're doing the wrong thing, if I just nod because I'm and go along with it and to avoid the jail time, to avoid the fine because I'm quite afraid, if I do that, I'm actually not being a good citizen. If I don't want to stand up against it, that might be okay because, look, you have different reasons to just avoid political trouble. But we need to not make that a virtue. Acting out of fear ends up meaning that somebody else has to fight the battle at some point. We protect our rights not because we're hyper-selfish Christian Australian nationalists or anything like that. We're not that. The reason we stand up for our rights and freedoms is because they're God-given, because people died for them. We want to respect that. But also because it's an act of love. Because my rights are the same as my neighbor's rights. And if I let my rights be stripped away from me, guess what's going to happen to my neighbor? The exact same thing. If I stand up for my rights, I might get punished and silenced, but at least I've stood the ground so that my neighbor can do the same. I've slowed the momentum a little bit of the tyranny. Or hopefully, if I can overturn it and push it back and appeal to the Constitution or the higher authority, appeal to the Caesar, whatever, then I can spare my neighbor from having to go through that. So it is actually an act of love. I say that because a lot of people will use that argument as to say, give up your rights for the sake of love. It's so unbecoming when Christians try and stand on their freedoms and their rights. Get over it. We're Christians. We serve a crucified Messiah. Yeah, true. But by God's grace and through the Christian worldview, history has changed and we actually have rights that people have fought for and that God has graciously given to us. And I have responsibilities as a citizen and as a neighbor. I want to love other people well, including my descendants well, by standing up for those rights so that these other people get to enjoy those rights as well. Standing up for my rights is standing up for their rights. And giving up my freedoms is only love if it benefits other people. If giving up my freedoms just benefits the abusive policeman, or just benefits a tyrannical leader, or just benefits me because it gets me out of trouble, that's not love. It's loving to give up our freedoms if it serves other people well. If me giving up my freedoms causes my neighbor to have to fight a bigger fight and have to get, now step up to the plate, it wasn't love. It was just self-preservation. And I think that's relevant. Loving your neighbor means standing up for your rights and their rights, especially those of your descendants, because our descendants are going to come after us and we want to leave them a legacy, just like our ancestors left us a legacy of freedoms. It is an act of love to say, there is another king whose name is Jesus, and he makes us free. Not free to revolt, not free to pull down the king, but we are free to live righteously. Therefore, we are free under God and free from tyranny. It's loving to tell your neighbors that. That's good news. It's loving to tell the government that. It's good news. Now, a little bit of application for church gathering. So we're speaking in general theological terms, and then I'm trying to apply it to our situation in COVID church time. In terms of church gathering, a lot of people will say, now, if the government says don't gather because of the health risk, and we want to gather, and we do gather, what about our witness? What about our Christian witness to the community? Shouldn't we prioritize loving our neighbors, or at least being seen to love our neighbors, over our own freedoms to gather? Well, I want to say that, as I've said already, standing up for our rights is actually an act of love for them. But anyway, church gathering itself, the act of gathering, I want you to think of Christians coming together, embracing one another, reading the Bible together, singing to Jesus, listening to the Word of God, praying with each other, sharing food together. That act is an act of witness to the world and a testimony to them, as well as an invitation in. It's an act of community love and service, because we're giving to them, we're formulating, we're forging, and we're opening the door to them to a refuge and a stabilizer in society. We're saying, come here and look what it is to be under a supreme king who loves us and gave his life for us. That puts the rest of our life and experience into context. Holding church in that way, gathering together, is a stabilizer to society. It's a good, I argue that it's a good civilian thing to do, to show my worried, fearful neighbors, hey, there's less need to be fear than you think. There's less need to be afraid than you think. There's more reason to be joyful and to be free than you realize. Come on in. Chris Hume is a writer of a great book called Essential Service, writing about the church and coronavirus. It's a great book. I recommend it to you. PDF online. I think you can get it for free. He says this: the coronavirus leaves over 95% of its victims still breathing. Now, at the time that I'm doing this video, I think I looked it up. The global statistics is it leaves 97-something% of people still breathing. The survival rate is over 97%. And in Australia, it's over 98%. But anyway, he's making this point that gathering is a good civilian, good neighbor thing to do, a good witness to give to the community, not a terrible witness. He says, so it leaves over 95% of its victims still breathing, but coronavirus leaves virtually every member of society afraid, anxious, isolated, alone, and wondering if anyone would notice if they were gone. In an increasingly atomized society, the coronavirus could rapidly mutate into an epidemic of despair. We need the moral and mental support of communities to be the decent people we all aspire to be. Man, I love that. Coronavirus is doing more than just killing 2 to 5% of its victims. It's leaving everyone afraid because of the overreaction and responses from our leaders. It's leaving everybody in anxiety and despair. The church has an opportunity to speak into that, to gather, to show them there's less need to be afraid. There's more reason to be joyful than you realize. Don't lose sight of the bigger picture. One of the things Chris is saying, and one of the things I'm trying to say is there's more risk to human life than just COVID. Right? Or whatever the state happens to say is the biggest risk at the time. There is more to risk human life. There is more risk to human life than just that thing. For example, the suicide rates and lifeline calls have been skyrocketing since all of these lockdowns have been applied. People have been killing themselves out of despair and anxiety and isolation and loneliness. That's not irrelevant. That's the world we live in. Things have consequences, and lockdowns and societal breakdown and isolation has consequences on people that at the moment seems to me to be a higher death toll than COVID in Australia. COVID is not the only thing that kills people. Do not fear those who kill the body, Jesus says, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both the soul and the body in hell. The church needs the boldness and the guts to say that. Yeah, some things can kill us out there. That's not the ultimate thing you need to fear. The ultimate thing we need to fear is God and obedience to him and his gospel.